Live. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It's Friday. You made it. It's the end of the week. Friday, May 20th, 2022. A couple of 20s in there. That's always helpful for the morning vocal exercises, if I did any. Anyway, so yeah, good morning. We'll sum up the week, get you ready for weekend discussion of all the crazy things that are happening, and hopefully a relaxing weekend ahead. By the way, I did happen to see this morning, I might have to take a look at this alert that just came across, just because there's some raw language in it. But I'll put that aside for a second. But I was thinking how lucky we were that Travis sent the story our way yesterday about Gary Lopez and his gubernatorial race. I don't know what his chances are in Colorado, but some wider attention, I guess, this morning. But you'll have had the news before it became news. I happened to notice a little discussion between Kyle Clark, whose story about Lopez we discussed from his nightly news broadcast, and Jay Rosen, famed press critic and Twitter denizen Jay Rosen, picking up on the story, saying, yeah, this does deserve some extra time. And Kyle out there selling the story hard to people like Jay, people like Dan Frumkin, and others, saying this story highlights the calls that frequently come from Jay and from Frumkin, and is it Michael Calderon? Yes, from, let's see, where is he now? Okay, is it Vanity Fair where he is now, and has been all over the place, of course, and highlighting that they've made these calls for newsrooms to add a democracy beat to their lineup. But he says, I'd settle for other Colorado media outlets deciding to cover this proposal to radically change democracy. I can understand perhaps why they're holding back a little bit. One, it's kind of crazy. Two, there are a lot of hurdles I would think you'd have to clear in Colorado to make that work. And three, he's not the nominee, I don't believe, Lopez, for governor. And I suppose were that to become the case, there would be some more attention. But it's a good point. You want to bring these stories up as soon as they are reported and discuss them a little bit. Why not prevent the guy from getting the nomination if you can help with that? We did it. I mean, we're not a national newsroom. But we did it thanks to Travis having brought it to our attention, of course. It wasn't like I was out scouring the wires for important democracy stories, which would be the case if there were, in fact, democracy beat reporters in these newsrooms. We have to support that idea, too, because if we want to have any reporting to read and reflect on here on the show, it's got to be out there and getting produced. But yeah, just a nice moment to see that it's getting attention from the people who try and guide newsrooms. I mean, they offer their advice, newsrooms often ignoring their advice, but trying to guide them in how to treat such stories and how important they actually are. And, well, we picked up on it. We liked it. So add Kagro in the morning to your news diet if the newsrooms won't do it. Of course, if the newsrooms won't do it, we won't have as many stories to share with you anyhow. But there you go. Just pointing out that it was like getting the news early, except that it was just getting the news when they report the news. The guy went on the news and told everybody, and Travis saw it and he said, hey, look at this. But it really was something, wasn't it? I mean, imagine at this juncture advocating that the electoral college model ought to be replicated on a state level, and then to not even do it by population, but to do it with this cockamamie formula that is designed from the start. I mean, what he wanted was what sort of voting scheme and vote counting scheme would give me a Republican victory? And the answer was wherever there are, I mean, essentially it came down to wherever there are fewer people in a county, give that county more electoral votes because of how awesome it is, and then I would win. I mean, if you counted up votes that weren't cast in my favor, well, then there you have it. I mean, who counts anything that way? But you remember the excuse was, well, the counties where voter turnout is highest would have their electoral votes weighted higher. So in some of these very, very small population counties where it doesn't take much to reach fairly substantial voter turnout. I mean, if it's normalized by population, look, if you have great turnout, you have great turnout, but that can't really be the measure by which you award value to the votes that are cast, just because it doesn't make any sense. It's not a representational democracy then. It's some other thing. And yes, you want to encourage voter turnout. But by the way, that would have to be then recalculated every year, every 2 years? I don't know how they would even keep up with that. And what confusion would ensue if the value of a vote from each county changed in weight every time there was an election. But essentially, all that was really happening there was, how could we rejigger the numbers? How can we reinvent counting such that Republicans win the governor's race in Colorado? And the answer, one answer would be, what if, and just bear with me for a second here, all you Republicans who are listening, there's 0 of you, but here's my proposal. What if you proposed policies for the state that were more popular, that more people liked than disliked? Because that's a way you could do it too, right? You'd still have to count the votes, of course. That's still basic. I think you don't think so, but that's one way you could do it. Offer the things that were more popular and then see how the vote counting goes. Or you could stick with your program offering the things that are considerably less popular, but whenever somebody votes for it, maybe because that's a good system, right? Suppose I propose things that are terrible for everyone in this state. Should we count the votes of people who say, no, I have self-interest here and I want to protect my self-interest. I'm voting according to my self-interest. Or do we want to count the votes of people who selflessly say, I will sacrifice for the state. I will accept these policies that are terrible for me personally because I believe that they're good for the state. Yes, let's do that instead. And don't we want to vote for the people who are selfless rather than those who are selfish? It's just absurd. I guess you can define things any way you want, but if you are interested in having a representative democracy, really, of course, there's only one way. The votes represent people on a one-to-one basis. But anyway, I doubt very much whether he was actually interested in increasing voter turnout, because, of course, that would usually lead to his losing the gubernatorial race even more overwhelmingly. But that's the cover. Essentially, though, all he was doing was, what kind of formula, how can I take these numbers and turn it into some other result? And, I'm sure that formula works once, and that's it. I'm not even certain that changes things in more than one election, especially once people find out. I guess once you find out that voter turnout changes things. By the way, if you're a Republican who believes this is great, and supposing this idea catches on, and people really do come out and take your advice, and they come out to vote, then you're never getting anywhere near public office again. Because not only would cities have considerably more people voting in them, but if they voted in greater numbers, they'd have an insurmountable lead in this. But I guess the thinking is, voter turnout in the cities is 50-something%, and voter turnout in these rural counties where there's hardly anybody living is 70-something. So maybe it would stay that way. All right. Well, anyway, it was a bizarre story and a bizarre proposal, but not something we need to spend a considerable amount of time on. I just was sort of proud that our listeners had picked up on this story that the media critics are having pitched to them, and at least one of them thinks is pretty important and worth his time. So, hooray for us. Meanwhile, my eye was caught this morning by a comment from Josh Marshall, who tweets a story about Madison Cawthorn and why not a day 3 situation for laughing at Madison Cawthorn. You can always have room for that in the agenda. And what caught my eye, he has this comment on the story. And of course, he's pitching it as covered by TPM, but this guy is one seriously disturbed little F. Is the line he chose. It's not the headline. That would have been a bold call. But let's see what's going on here. Defeated Cawthorn resurfaces with ominous post vowing dark MAGA, I guess, takeover, maybe? Let's see. Dark MAGA takeover. Yeah, I guessed it. It was the wordle of the day. Trying to figure out what the other characters were that were cut off by Twitter. Let's see. Fresh, I was wondering what he would do in the wake of his defeat. Fresh off his primary defeat, Representative Madison Cawthorn on Thursday reemerged with a threatening post on Instagram vowing vengeance with a dark MAGA takeover. Yeah, they got to push that guy off a cliff. In his post, Cawthorn praised right-wing figures who came to his defense when it was not politically profitable, is the end of that quote. The post includes a photo with a list of names of people he deems to be his allies, such as former President Trump and Representatives Marjorie Taylor Greene and Matt Gaetz. Cawthorn wrote that he is on a mission aimed at ending, well, it says Gentile politics. I think he means gentle politics, though honestly, that's not a bad idea. I think they should end Gentile politics. Leave it to the rest of us. Okay. Well, anyway, spelling error or not, it's worthy of consideration. He also name-checked the fringe online movement that calls itself Dark MAGA. That is, I guess, people who want to make America, or how can we say, I don't know. I guess make America Gentile again is what their aim is. But anyway, but it always has been, so it's not really a problem. He also name-checked this fringe movement, Dark MAGA. I am on a mission now to expose those who say and promise one thing, yet legislate and work towards another. Self-profiteering, which is not really, it's just regular profiteering. But globalist goal. Okay, sure, Cawthorn wrote, it's time for the rise of the new right. It's time for Dark MAGA to truly take command. And it is, in fact, time, as I said yesterday, for an ejector seat to be built into those wheelchairs that he's using. All right, well, it's about time. Cawthorn's primary challenge defeat on Tuesday night followed a series of controversies during a short-lived congressional career, which included his claims about sexual perversion that goes on in Washington, which apparently rattled his GOP colleagues. The so-called Dark MAGA movement calls for Trump to return to power in order to exact revenge on his enemies. It began as a campaign posting threatening Terminator-style memes on social media, but has now gained popularity among some of Trump's prominent supporters, such as Greene, if you can call her prominent, as Insider explained last week. Earlier this month, Greene tweeted a meme in line with the Dark MAGA aesthetic, which often depicts Trump in black and red tinged images with laser beams coming out of his eyes. And here is one with that I guess Marjorie did to herself and gave herself laser beam eyes and tinged herself red because she's such a tough Terminator type person. And here it is when she says in her tweet, when it comes to Make America Great Again, I'm all in and I can't even understand anyone who is not. Hashtag Ultra MAGA. Well, I have no doubt that you can't understand anyone who's not, and that's good reason to be rid of you, of course, but there's so many things you don't understand. Adding one more to the list is not difficult to contemplate. Despite lacking an explicit endorsement from Trump, the Dark MAGA movement continues to gain more traction among prominent right-wingers, such as Jack Posobiec, or however he says his name, and Amanda Milius, who I'm not familiar with, but I guess that's a name to watch too. Experts who spoke with Insider warned that Dark MAGA, with its aesthetic promoting nationalist and neo-Nazi imagery, hooray, could be the far right's latest efforts to push extremism online through the use of memes. Well, obviously, they've been up to that for a long, long time. That's their preferred methodology. And that's what you do when you're lacking numbers and actual support, is you just make things look really scary on social media. It works to some extent, but you rile the 25% that you're able to rile and then go ahead and lose your primary. That's how it goes. Interesting, though, that he's out there already vowing revenge, and a little bit like the first story, that basically, I mean, what the result of the primary is that Madison Cawthorn has not got political power. He has not got political clout, not at home, not nationally, not anywhere, and his view of what to do about that is to exact revenge on people, to become, again, a MAGA terrorist who will threaten everyone who has withheld their consent that he govern. So democratic. They just love the Constitution so much. All right, so something to remember Madison Cawthorn by, and it's probably a good idea to start getting ready to, well, think about how you're going to marginalize and eliminate these people who can do nothing but threaten. So, all right. No surprise there, but certainly very interesting, and I have to agree with Josh's assessment there. Speaking of that, I guess we could walk over here, clomp, 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 there we go, to the Hill, where Emily Brooks reports on a story running under the headline GOP, or as we like to say, GOP frustration. GOP frustration builds with Freedom Caucus floor tactics. Still making a problem for everybody there. Republicans in disarray, but no one ever uses that headline because it's not alliterative. Some GOP lawmakers, GOP lawmakers, are getting frustrated with the hardline tactics of the conservative House Freedom Caucus. What are they up to? Let's find out. Members of the group have forced recorded votes on normally non-controversial bills on the suspension calendar. We all know about those. Forcing lawmakers to hang around the chamber for hours to get their votes in rather than conduct other business. It led to a confrontation on Tuesday night during a 2.5-hour vote series on 13 separate measures between Representative Mike Rogers of Alabama, the ranking member of the House Armed Services Committee, and I guess on behalf of the Freedom Caucus, Chip Roy of Texas and Scott Perry of Pennsylvania. Perry, of course, in the January 6th crosshairs. And ironically, Chip Roy thinks he's the hero of January 6th, but whatever. Republicans gave different accounts of just how heated a discussion took place. Goodness. One source familiar with the situation said Rogers, with a raised voice, said that there will be consequences or repercussions for members of the House Freedom Caucus if the delaying tactics continue. A GOP member on the floor at the time of the exchange confirmed that version of events. Rogers, however, told The Hill that he didn't make any threats and insisted that the conversation was not heated on his part. He said that he told Freedom Caucus members, "I'm just telling y'all, I'm giving you a heads up. You're getting a lot of ill will around here. This stuff will come back to you. You can't just do this to people and think that they're not going to remember it." Well, people aren't great at remembering things, but all right. Let's see. I was just being, a senior member trying to help members understand what goes around comes around in this place, Rogers said. Representatives Andy Biggs, in the 1-6 crosshairs himself, Matt Gaetz, another one, and Tim Burchett, not yet, Tim Burchett, who is not in the Freedom Caucus, apparently, was also present for the exchange. Bills and resolutions considered under the suspension of the rules have historically passed by voice vote, often with few members in the House chamber. They account for the majority of bills passed in a modern Congress. But House Freedom Caucus members last year started demanding recorded votes for those bills, drastically changing the pace of floor action. They were, of course, trying to prevent anything from happening. The more time you burn, the less time there is for passing substantive legislation. Perry and Roy, in a joint interview, argued that most all bills deserve a recorded vote. I don't know which one they meant. Most bills or all bills. That gives, let's see, they all deserve a recorded vote. That it gives more time for members to review the legislation, and that leadership often sneaks through controversial bills as suspension bills. They really don't. Members should not be considered as on the record supporting a bill that passed by voice vote if they did not get a chance to vote on it, they say. What ought to happen in this body, irrespective of what we're doing at any particular moment, is we ought to have a consensus on a fair way to move bills through appropriately, where we start with the default position of voting, and you're only moving something by voice or consent when there's universal agreement that it is unobjectionable, Roy says. I mean, it's not crazy, but, I mean, typically you're doing this for non-controversial things. I mean, if you find that they really are sneaking things through, then the appropriate response is, in fact, to demand a vote on everything so that the leadership doesn't do this anymore. But what they're doing, of course, is just trying to burn floor time. What's controversial about naming a post office after, I don't know, Santa Claus, right? Well, we've got to have a vote on it. The default position is that there ought to be a vote. Nah, you really don't have to do that, but of course, somebody could object, I suppose. And the opportunity is there. Just go and have support behind you and make your objections heard. But I have a feeling that this excuse is cover for their actual tactic, which is just about burning as much floor time as possible. Anyway, Freedom Caucus members have also argued that the tactic helps slow down and delay Democrats' agenda. That's the real reason. The suspension bills need support from 2/3 of the House to pass, and because of the requests for recorded vote, some of the measures have failed due to Republican opposition. A bill to require collection of small business loan data to LGBTQ-owned businesses in order to prohibit discrimination, as well as a bill to require the Department of Veterans Affairs to provide access to contraceptives without co-pays, failed under suspension last year, but later passed after going through the normal rules process. Another measure to allow the District of Columbia to increase pay for its chief financial officer also failed under suspension. But those bills are the exception, and many of the recorded votes result in a handful of nays. Freedom Caucus members frequently vote in favor of the bills, and some get unanimous support. Recent measures considered under suspension of the rules that passed with overwhelming support included bills requiring training for Department of Veterans Affairs employees on reporting wrongdoing and directing the Treasury Secretary to secure debt relief for Ukraine. Representative Thomas Massey of Kentucky was the only vote against a resolution calling on leaders to condemn anti-Semitism on Wednesday. But some of the requests prompt public pushback. Just before the House was set to vote on 5 bills to name post offices, I'm not kidding about those things, last Thursday, Representative Scott DeJarle drugged his patients and had sex with them. That's not what he did. On Thursday, though, I'm sorry, I'm mistaken. I must be reading the wrong date article here. On Thursday, Scott DeJarle asked that the ordering for the yeas and nays on 5 post office naming bills be vacated, since all of the names were after members of the military and, quote, war heroes, as he said. Members on both sides of the aisle cheered. Okay, he's actually, moving things along here. That's funny. Anyway, Representative Andrew Clyde of Georgia objected, drawing boos, and members stayed for another 45 minutes to vote on the bill. So by the way, what's happening here is, if you thought that we were still living in that reality where House Freedom Caucus members, they love freedom, they love calling themselves patriots, and they're always lionizing the military. They'll never survive politically if they start bashing the military or refusing to kowtow to the military. And Scott DeJarle, who's a bad person, actually taking a decent position here, but trying to hold them to account in terms of their rah-rahing for the military, right? All these post offices are being renamed for fallen members of the military, and it's typically that. I'm not all of them necessarily, but probably this batch. People who were killed in action in service of the country, and they're therefore, in his view anyway, war heroes, and how dare you stand in the way. And if everybody just recognized that that's what was going on, no Republican would dare stand in the way. And the answer is, oh no, and just at the drop of a hat, the Freedom Caucus will in fact stand in the way, and then go home and talk about how they support the troops and they're huge patriots, and people will say, yeah, look at that red hat. So that's the reality of things. Anyway, some Republican members walking into votes before a session that ended just before 11 p.m. on Wednesday night openly grumbled about being there so late for non-controversial bills. Representative Andy Biggs, who was Freedom Caucus chair last year before Perry, said on Gates's podcast on Wednesday, like he's got time for a podcast, that guy, can you believe it? That a Republican who was in his face on the House floor Tuesday night said that he had better get things to be, that he had better things to be doing than voting. Okay. And I said, well, like what? And he said, well, I can't do my social media and I can't do media hits, Biggs said, which is funny because he's like, well, that guy should be working. But he's saying it where? On Matt Gates's podcast. So you tell me who's in the wrong on this one. All right. Well, at any rate, let's wrap things up before we hit the break here. The long vote sessions in the evening can also keep members from fundraisers, or sleeping for that matter, meetings with constituents and interest groups, and other activities. Gates mused on his podcast this week that the recent floor confrontations are an indication of a fight brewing between the Freedom Caucus and GOP leadership. Perry downplayed that, though. They've been somewhat agnostic about it, Perry said of the GOP leadership. They know that some people are for it and some people don't like it. That is a genius statement. We'll be right back. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, the same guy who was just talking to you a second ago. Our Patreon subscription drive is still going strong, with over 175 monthly donors who help keep us on the air. If we've helped keep you going during the pandemic, why not return the favor and help us keep going so we can all be together for the next disaster? Patreon.com, Patreon.com, makes it easy to make secure, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. Maybe you'd like to thank us for keeping you sane during the Trump era. Maybe you're looking forward to in-depth explanations of what's going on in the Biden administration. Whatever it is that keeps you listening, we need your help to keep bringing it to you. And hey, if you happen to prefer using PayPal or even the Square Cash app, we're up and running with those options too. Thanks again, everyone, for all your support. We literally could not do this without you. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Roots Radio. There's a little bit more to this story from the Hill. We'll just wrap up so that you get the full flavor of what's going on here. As we said here, it's the genius statement from Scott Perry was that some people are for this tactic that they're using, and some people don't like it. But the dynamic, if that is one, could preview pressure tactics that the hardline conservative caucus shifts onto its own party leaders next year. That is, if there is a Republican majority in the House, would they continue to do this? Perry didn't rule out calling for voice votes on suspension bills next year if Republicans win the majority and the leadership continues the practice of passing suspension bills by voice vote. We hope this is not an issue because we're hoping that we can get some point of fairness now that becomes the standard, Perry said. Freedom Caucus members also argued that Democrats control the House schedule and how long it takes to vote. Pandemic-era proxy voting, requiring members to vocally vote for a member not present, can stretch 5-minute votes to 10 or 15 minutes. Woo-wee. But members are still making better time than the beginning of 2021, when procedures put in place due to COVID-19 kept all votes open for 45 minutes. I wish the Democrats could speed it up. Maybe we should do 2-minute votes, said Representative Kathy McMorris Rogers. So interesting. She obviously not a member of the Freedom Caucus, at least not in this thinking. wants the votes to move even faster. And you could do it, but it would require a rules change. But at any rate, it's interesting to watch this fight. And yeah, I suppose it's possible that next year under a Republican majority, the Freedom Caucus people could still do it. I mean, they just don't like the idea of things being cleared for voice votes. I guess they don't trust the people clearing them. And what's interesting is that the usual role of the leadership, even the minority leadership in something like this, is they are protecting members, in their view anyway. The thinking is that they're essentially protecting members from what could become bad votes. Like, you have a certain number of crackpots in your Republican caucus at any given time. I mean, at this point, it might be that it's more than 50% of the conference, as they call it. But it's usually not the case. It's usually some minor fraction of idiots. And, of course, it's certainly possible to have a couple of Democratic crackpots as well, in case anybody wants to have some, fairness on this issue. Both sides. I mean, there were Jim traffickants in the world. But essentially, you've got, like Scott DeJarle would have it, you're renaming post offices for, military service members who were killed in the line of duty or something like that. And you're going to have crackpots like, I guess, Thomas Massey, for instance, or, Marjorie Trader Green, who might, for instance, have no idea that the United States military is ours and we're supposed to be supporting it. Wouldn't that be interesting if she took the radical position, the leftist radical position of, maybe we ought not to be lauding and glorifying every member of the service who dies in the line of duty, because maybe they shouldn't all of them be on duty. We should be reducing things in the military and taking a less aggressive posture. Who knows? But I don't think that's the position she's taking. But at any rate, it's available to her. But what I think is usually happening with these, when you bring a bill that's relatively you think is non-controversial, or ought to be, in the olden days was considered non-controversial, you bring it and you take it to the other side's leadership and say, we propose putting this on the suspension calendar and we think we can handle this one by voice vote. And you give them and their staff a chance to look at it. And, Chip Roy's complaint is, and it does make a certain amount of sense. We don't get a chance. You don't have enough time to read and review the bill and think about it and make sure that it's one that you want to go through. The point is, you're supposed to be able to, and I guess they just don't, trust your leadership that in these meetings that take place ahead of time, when they say, all right, here's what we propose to put on the suspension calendar. Here's your chance to review it. If you think it's relatively non-controversial, one, you can speed things up by agreeing to the voice vote. And two, by agreeing to the voice vote, you're signaling to your conference that we've read this thing and it really is non-controversial. And though we may have a couple of crackpots who would have their own crackpot reasons for voting against such a thing, let them shout out no, and let there not be a roll call vote, lest they convince some of the rest of you that you should listen to their crackpot reasoning and vote in crackpot fashion, and then be on the record doing so. In many cases, this was just a crowd control response. Like, we might have a bunch of idiots who might be willing to vote no on this, or who reflexively vote no on anything proposed by a Democrat, things like that. Or we may also have people who are hardliners who love to run on the subject and on the claim that they've never voted for anything that a Democrat has proposed. Now, that's not a traditional position, but lately, the last, 10, 20 years, there really have been an increasing number of Republicans who would want to run on such a claim. And yet, the bill is, sometimes there's a legitimate reason to have chosen somebody who has stood out in their service to the country and name a post office after them. But, of course, that having been proposed by a Democrat, these hardline Republicans would have to vote no on it. But instead, we'll just do it by voice vote so that there's no record of you being such a crackpot, and there isn't the attack material available to your Democratic opponent running against you in November saying, this guy voted against the Santa Claus bill. And it's, it's for your own good, essentially. But Republicans are saying they no longer trust the judgment of their leadership in determining whether or not something is truly non-controversial or that it's truly in your best interest not to have a recorded vote written down for you on this. Basically, I'm sure they thought that they were. I don't know if anybody in the Republican leadership anticipated Thomas Massie voting no on the anti-Semitism bill, on whatever, condemning anti-Semitism. But it's possible. They might know he's a real lunatic. And they say, who knows, there might be more such lunatics. And if 10 Republican crackpots vote no on this thing, there's some chance that they'll be able to hold it over their heads or campaign against them or even tar the whole party with it. We just don't want to see any number of Republicans voting no on condemning anti-Semitism. And so we'd like to, to the extent that we have some, we want to take their voices away and have a voice vote on this thing. But the Freedom Caucus insists on being allowed to tar themselves and their party with bad acts. So I guess you got to give into it. And whether Kevin McCarthy and the rest of them will give into it, I guess they're doing it now. There's no punishment for them at this point, even though, what's his name? Threatened that there could be. Who was it that said it right up at the beginning? Mike Rogers. And I guess they're just not listening to that guy. Anyway, the story mentions Thomas Massie, and as it turns out, there's a Thomas Massie story in pocket here. Let's call it a segue and jump over to it from MSNBC, the Maddow blog, where Steve Bannon holds court. Why did Trump change his mind about Kentucky's Thomas Massie? And I have no idea because I didn't know that he had any sense that Thomas Massie existed or was a person. But as it turns out, there's some story here. The subheader tells the tale. 2 years ago, Donald Trump wanted Thomas Massie thrown out of the GOP, the GOP. Now, the former president is endorsing the Kentucky Republican, which just tells you a little something about the value of his endorsement and why you're chasing your tail hoping to get it. I have no idea. So many other stories circulating this week about people who couldn't stop debasing themselves in the service of Trump, but then didn't get an endorsement. And so, Thomas Massie thinks he's in the opposite position, but one day you'll not get that endorsement, and you'll say, where's the loyalty? Or you could do it in reverse. Or when you're getting if you had any, sense of history, for instance, when you get the endorsement, you might think, I should keep in mind that 2 years ago he wanted me thrown out of the party. Now he's endorsing me. But I'm sure we'll never reach another low point in this high-low pattern. Steve Bannon explains further. Around this time 2 years ago, as Donald Trump endorsed a series of allies in assorted Republican primaries, the then president and his allies took pride in a brief undefeated streak. Every GOP, I still can't bring myself to say it, but every GOP contender supported by Trump won his or her primary race in the spring and early summer of 2020. In June 2020, however, the Republican streak ended after Representative Thomas Massie of Kentucky tried to derail a COVID relief package. The then president called him a third-rate grandstander and said he wanted the GOP congressman to be thrown out of the Republican Party. So at least he wasn't impulsive about it, right? Voters in Kentucky's 4th congressional district proceeded to ignore Trump's condemnations. Massie won his primary race by 76 points after cruising to a landslide victory in the fall. I said after, but I meant before. You know how the seasons work, right? First, he wins the primary race by 76 points, then cruises to a landslide victory in the fall. Last week, the former president endorsed the third-rate grandstander whom he previously wanted to kick out of the Republican Party. In a written statement, Trump said, Congressman Thomas Massie is a conservative warrior for Kentucky's 4th Congressional District. The district everyone loves. It's not the first district in Kentucky, and it's not the last. It's the 4th. So I'm just imagining how he would be reading this off a teleprompter. And of course, right, if he's reading it off the teleprompter, then he reads it this way. A MIT graduate and a first-rate defender of the Constitution. A MIT graduate. That's MIT, of course. Thomas fights hard to protect your liberties. There's so many... The random capitalization in this is unbelievable. Thomas fights hard to protect your liberties, especially the First and Second Amendments, which are under siege by the radical left, strong on the border, and our military and vets. Thomas Massie has my complete and total endorsement. Again, capitalization, complete and total endorsement. I wish there was some inflection we could give it to let you know just how frequently he capitalizes words. It's interesting that he even does that. I mean, I wonder, does staff do that for him? Because I just can't imagine, I can't even imagine him going through the extra effort of hitting the shift key on something. And on Twitter, or whatever he's using, Truth Social, a second thumb, forget about it. Anyway, he made no reference to the criticisms of the GOP congressman from 2 years ago. It's difficult to say with confidence exactly why Trump changed his mind, though a Washington Post report noted over the weekend, Massie has carved out a niche as Congress's most relentless opponent of assisting Ukraine in the wake of the Russian invasion. Massie, 51, the Washington Post reports, is the only member of the House to hold a perfect 16-for-16 record in opposing legislation to support Ukraine and oppose Russia. According to House records and a Democratic analysis provided to the Washington Post, his views remain a minority, but his allies in this cause include some of the closest allies to Trump, who is strongly considering another run for president and has espoused his own fondness for Putin. Massie went on to boast to the newspaper that he wants the United States to abandon NATO. The Republican lawmaker also endorsed a policy in which Ukraine preemptively surrendered portions of its country to Russian control. It was against this backdrop that Trump called Massie last week, according to the congressman. It was their first direct conversation in more than 2 years, and the Kentucky congressman described the agenda as glorious. Boy. A day later, the former president endorsed Massie as first-rate. That's funny that he would use the terminology considering that he had previously said he was third-rate. Now he's first-rate. To be sure, I have no idea, says Steve, if Trump changed his mind about Massie because the GOP congressman is a fierce opponent of supporting Ukraine during the ongoing crisis, but it appears, at a minimum, that the former president isn't troubled by Massie's recent efforts. I thought he was going to go in a different direction here. I might have ended that one by saying, to be sure, I have no idea if Trump changed his mind about Massie because there's no telling what's going on in Trump's mind. He might not even know he's changed his mind. He may have no memory whatsoever of his fight with Massie from 2 years ago. But for the people who think that the president is very, super petty and vindictive and holds grudges and remembers them, there's that theory. But I have the other theory, which is that he used to do that and currently wants to do that, but is in fact just not sharp enough mentally to keep that up, and probably has no idea about Thomas Massie and who he is and why he was supposed to be mad at him. Anyway, I thought that was somewhat interesting. Glad to share that with you. Let's see. Other things I should update you on. Ah, yes. Before the break, we should perhaps catch up on... I'm still waiting for further reporting on it, and maybe there is something that was written overnight that I ought to have put on the radar. But big events yesterday in the orbit of the January 6th committee. with respect to the early claims that there were certain members of Congress on January 5th or thereabouts, in their second or third day in office for some of them, who were leading tours around the Capitol that aroused a lot of suspicion. And that's been a lingering accusation. And at some point, the accusation came to include Representative Barry Loudermilk of Georgia, about whom I know almost nothing else. But apparently he was accused of leading one of these tours. And first he denied it. Then I believe at some point, he denied it, and then he filed an ethics complaint against Congresswoman Mikey Sherrill and others who persisted in their claim that there were such members leading such tours, saying that she had failed to provide proof that he or any member had in fact engaged in leading these tours, and so therefore there ought to be some sort of ethics committee consequences for those leveling these accusations that they could not prove. But, anyway, it turns out that this is rather backfired on him, or perhaps is about to backfire on him, because apparently the January 6th committee says, okay, well, now that you have filed an ethics complaint saying this is entirely untrue and somebody else ought to be the one in trouble ethically, not me, for lying about my having led one of these tours, the January 6th committee has now that he's stepped on that landmine, said, as it happens, we have some video evidence. We have video of you leading such a tour. So that has, I think, if I understand the chronology of things correctly, has prompted him to say, well, I led a tour, but it was entirely innocent. It was just a family from the district visiting, and they wanted to show their kids the Capitol, which is something that frequently happens. And it happens all the time. January 5th is not often the date that's chosen, but it could be. I don't know how long Barry Loudermilk has been in office, whether this is his first term or not. Like, it would surprise me if he was already giving tours. But it surprises me that any of them were giving tours. But I have been reminded, January 5th, 2021, the Capitol was not open for tours. COVID had closed and canceled the whole thing. They were not supposed to be giving people tours, innocent or otherwise. But he did do that. And now we have to find out, I guess, in the hearings in June, we'll find out a little bit more, perhaps, about what they think the nature of this tour was. But our Twitter friend, NYC Southpaw, was commenting on the situation, saying that yesterday there was news that the January 6th committee says it has evidence that Representative Barry Loudermilk of Georgia's 11th District led a tour through the Capitol on 1/5, and House Republicans covered it up. That's the interesting part. And he's got a screen grab from this. I guess, is this from the committee asking, we write to seek your voluntary cooperation in advancing our investigation. Based on our review of evidence in the select committee's possession, we believe you have information regarding a tour you led through parts of the Capitol complex on January 5th, 2021. The foregoing information raises questions to which the select committee must seek answers. Public reporting and witness accounts indicate some individuals and groups engaged in efforts to gather information about the layout of the U.S. Capitol, as well as the House and Senate office buildings in advance of January 6th. For example, in the week following January 6th, members urged law enforcement leaders to investigate sightings of outside groups in the complex on January 5th that appeared to be associated with the rally at the White House the following day. In response to these allegations, Republicans on the Committee on House Administration, of which you are a member, claimed to have reviewed security footage from the days preceding January 6th and determined that there were no tours, no large groups. And then I guess that no one did this, and no one with MAGA hats on, as they said. However, the Select Committee's review of evidence directly contradicts that denial. So that's interesting. I'd love to find out what happened over at the House Administration Committee and how they reviewed this thing. Then Southpaw reminds us just over a year ago, Loudermilk himself filed an ethics complaint against Sherrill for making a similar accusation and put out this statement, basically denying the whole thing. Democrats accuse Republicans of reconnaissance tours without evidence. Republicans file ethics complaint and urge investigation into member misconduct. That's the headline he gave his own press release here. And then saying a member of Congress accusing another member of Congress of committing a crime without evidence is morally reprehensible and a stain on this institution. No Republican member of Congress led any kind of reconnaissance tours through the Capitol, proven by security footage captured by U.S. Capitol Police. So, and then he goes on to accuse the accusers. These 34 members of Congress who willfully and gleefully levied these unsubstantiated accusations on television, radio, social media, and in the letter to the Senate Sergeant-at-Arms, House Sergeant-at-Arms, and the United States Capitol Police need to be investigated and subjected to the requisite consequences. Well, last year's ethics complaint is signed by Loudermilk and for some reason notarized. That is included in this recitation of facts from Southpaw here. If the evidence bears out the allegation that Loudermilk truly led a tour that fits this description, what he calls an accusation of treason, this ethics committee gambit will go down in the all-time Chutzpah Hall of Fame. Can you imagine if they actually do, in fact, reveal evidence at their hearings or elsewhere that Loudermilk did this? In the meantime, Loudermilk is not only denying it, but filing ethics charges against others. All right. Well, lastly in the chain here, Loudermilk now admits for the first time he did lead a tour on 1-5, but says it was wholly innocent. As he says, a constituent family with young children meeting with their member of Congress in the House office buildings is not a suspicious or group reconnaissance tour. It's not, but it does raise questions because, as people in the responses say, there weren't any tours being given. We were at the height of the pandemic at that stage. But all right, we'll see how that one develops and whether or not he finds himself in trouble for that one. We will see. One quick thing I can add before our top of the hour break, which I thought was of some interest. We haven't paid a lot of attention to it, but New York has, they've given themselves fits. Democrats in New York and the state legislature have been causing problems for a long time. They are, of course, in charge of the redistricting that's going to go on in New York, and mischief makers that they are. Apparently, the New York redistricting has turned into a disaster for Democrats. It's just in general. I mean, it was going to be anyhow. Redistricting is always problematic, and Democrats dominate the board when it comes to congressional representation for the state. Anyway, and they have great difficulty in tight quarters in the New York City area very often because any change in the lines can be drastic and can take, thousands of voters out of one person's pool and put them in another. And like I say, tight quarters where the districts are small and compact because of the population density, and as very frequently happens in New York and elsewhere, we have a situation, or several situations, I think, in which multiple incumbents could be thrown into primaries against one another. And it's definitely happening in New York, where, moving a line over by a couple of blocks means that somebody whose district, used to be, or this block where the member of Congress actually lives, used to be in this district and is now in that district, and the current representative of that district also likewise, but he hasn't been drawn out of the district. They now both live there, and very often, especially in the urban districts, what'll happen is somebody says, well, I'll move, I'll get another apartment, or I'll get a second apartment and claim that the other one is my primary residence. Whatever it is, whether it's shenanigans or not, they very frequently will move over to the next district so they can avoid this problem, but not always. And apparently, Sean Patrick Maloney is involved in just such a situation, although I forget off the top of my head whose district he's now drawn into. But there's a significant fight to be had here between two strong candidates in a single primary. What's interesting about all of this, of course, is apparently Maloney, he has the option, I suppose, of moving, but he doesn't want to. He thinks whoever else he's in conflict with, I guess, should be the one to move. But Sean Patrick Maloney has been, I think, head of the DCCC for some time. And interesting point made here by one Evan Roth Smith, on Twitter, founding partner at Slingshot Strategy and pollster to the stars, as he says. That's funny in his Twitter bio. But Sean Patrick Maloney at the DCCC, of course, has been reacting to. It's typically a reaction to, say, progressive candidates opting to join primaries, to file in primaries to run against more conservative Democrats or people certainly who they think are perhaps out of step with the district, where they could be electing a more progressive member, or they just simply don't like that member, or whatever it is, whatever the motivation is. But they're thinking Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez style challenges to like Joe Crowley, established senior members of the Democratic leadership, and taking them on and I'm sure in their view, demagoguing them right out of office. So he's come up, of course, with the formulation whereby it is, a violation of democratic rules, and the DCCC will come down on you like a ton of bricks, as opposed to, say, helping you with your campaign, or even staying neutral. Come down on you like a ton of bricks if you challenge a Democratic incumbent in a primary. So Evan quite correctly asks, so now that Sean Patrick Maloney is primarying the Democratic incumbent in the 17th district, is he going to be added to the DCCC blacklist? He is, right? Yeah, I think not, but you know why. That's funny. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Roots Radio. Yeah, that would be a good question, don't you think? Essentially, it comes down to this, right? What I meant was that you outsiders aren't allowed to primary Democratic incumbents, whereas awesome insiders who are totally great, like me, can primary incumbent members. It's totally different. I am an incumbent member. He's primarying me. He should be on the block. Now, that'd be really... That'd be the chutzpah move of all chutzpah. That might even outdo Thomas Massey if you're looking for an opportunity to do that. Okay. It's an interesting question, though, given the stridency with which the policy was promulgated. Let me take a look at this. This is an emerging story. Joshua Holland sharing this story, or this tweet just now, saying, hey, maybe Dems shouldn't be quite so cowed by the right's culture war BS, although I do see that he's got a typo and he's snuck an extra I into the word for BS so that it's Buil, B-U-I-L-L, and then, the famous S word, the one everyone always talks about. So maybe we can say that out loud. Can we say Buil shit? No, probably not, because it still contains... Honestly, it is a compound word, so we still have that problem. All right. Well, do I bleep myself? Probably not. I kind of muddled that word. You don't know what I was saying. I was saying... All right, well, I guess I was pretty clear about that one. Oh, by the way, everyone who was listening live enjoy Greg trying to fix his phone with the mic on yesterday? That was a good one. I was thinking... as I decided what to do with that one. Do I even bleep that? It was very difficult to hear, but he whispered. But it was a new one for Greg. He's very frequent with the BS thing. That comes up all the time. And that, by the way, is moving into the category of things that even the FCC doesn't really care about on broadcast television nearly as much. And there's a certain BS exception, like a generalized usage that somehow is not supposed to be, scatological in some way. Just a slang term for lying now, and we'll allow it. But not the word that he used when he realized that the phone was ringing. That one is still out, I think. And at least Mighty OCD picked that one up. A whispered, bleeped word that was fun. But it occurred to me, well, one, of course, there are several of you who have said on repeated occasions, numerous occasions, it's stupid to bleep anything. And it is. It's dumb. It's not on broadcast radio. I think we originally did it with the idea in mind that, well, what if we ever get picked up by actual broadcast radio again and they want to simulcast and put our show on the air, and we run a rerun and it has a word in it that will get an actual radio station in trouble, and we had the opportunity to bleep it out and we didn't do it, that would be irresponsible of us. So something. But meanwhile, the problem is if it happens 2, 3, 4 times a month, I am creating, when I'm backing up the files and saving the old shows so that I can use them again, or just, have an archive. I've got one high quality recording of it, but I tried to keep ones as it ran. Then, if I want to do it as a rerun, I have a bleeped version, high quality, that I would use, and that's what I would send to Justice to plug in to use it as a rerun. And then I have the bleeped lower quality recording that I use just to save space and make it easier to upload a month's worth of podcasts. So when we distribute the podcast via Libsyn, that one's a lower quality. But anyway, what it means is I have 3 recordings of a show that has a bleep in it, and just 2 recordings of a show that manages to successfully avoid bleeping. And if there's 3 or 4 of them in a single month, then when I go to archive the show and back them up to DVDs and store them and remove them from my hard drive, the month's worth of shows is just barely too large to fit on a single DVD, and I have to split it into 2, and it's quite annoying. That's, not really a very serious issue, but people wonder, why bleep at all? And when I have to go through this exercise of bleeping it for one thing and then creating the 2 DVDs for a month instead of the 1, I do wonder to myself whether it really is worth doing. And then I thought, I wonder if I could somehow recover some of this time by monetizing this thing. I wonder what kind of market there would be for a DVD collection of all of Greg's bleeped moments or something without the bleeping, and just a full, I could sell for, I'll mail it to you for, I don't know, $10, a DVD compilation of all the uncensored Greg Dworkin moments. Although, and it sounds like a great product, and I don't want to ruin it now, but honestly, then I started thinking, what's the value of, I don't know, how much would it total up to? Half an hour of hearing Greg say BS. I mean, that's the one he usually uses. The big payoff was the one for the phone, which was a new usage for him. Although we always could send you the uncensored versions of Greg's manifesto on vaccines.
Oh my fucking God, get the fucking vaccine already, you fucking fucks.
But you have a pretty good idea what's being said there anyway. So, I don't know. We'll come up with something. I just want a unique product, that's all. At any rate, that wasn't why I picked up on Joshua Holland in his tweet. He doesn't say, oh yes, that's right, he misspells the word for BS. But anyway, the real point he's making is that maybe Dems shouldn't be so cowed by the right's culture war misspelled BS. And here's why. There are 2 links here, but I guess the screen grabs tell the story. First, Durham's GOPS, Better Board, Better Schools candidate slate is soundly defeated. I have the feeling that the Better Board, Better Schools slogan was a lie. 5 Republicans vying to win control of Durham's progressive school board were soundly defeated in Tuesday's election. 4 of the 5 finished last in their respective races. So that seems like really good news. And it looks like the news comes from, well, which one? Are they both from Durham? Or the second screen grab is majority of, quote, parents' rights candidates lose in capital region school elections. school board races, which featured many candidates pushing back against diversity and sexuality issues in education, caused huge swell in turnout. And I'm not certain whether that's the North Carolina capital area or the national capital area or some other capital area. Let me open up the linked stories here, and we'll see if we can find out if we're talking about more than one story. I'll look at the capital region one first from the TimesUnion.com. Where's the Times Union from? I can't immediately tell, though we could look it up in Wikipedia. Do the ads tell the story? Not yet. What about the news story? Voters turned out in force in many capital region school districts Tuesday, and it appears many showed up to reject the new movement that vowed to, quote, take back our schools, a national phenomenon that saw at least 35 such candidates on local school board ballots. So an excellent point because it's a national thing, but this is a great eye by Josh Holland here. I should be currently now retweeting this tweet so that you can all see it. And like I said, good point, because they made lots of noise like the Tea Party did, and they got covered like the Tea Party got covered. Like, this is a national movement. It's happening everywhere. Parents are fed up. That was the explanation for the Virginia gubernatorial election, as opposed to it being the dude who's running for governor as a Democrat is the dude who was the candidate a couple years ago, and nobody found him like terribly exciting, but we didn't want to elect a Trump light, but nobody believed that the guy in the fleece vest who looked like a friendly doofus was going to be Trumpy, and it really had more to do with that than anything else. And then, of course, making Loudoun County the centerpiece of his campaign, but then being soundly defeated in Loudoun County. Was there really any there? Well, it turns out that in some other places where people said, I'm going to run for office based on this theory that all parents are fed up with their school boards, and it turns out, no, they're really not. So let's see if we can figure out where we're talking about here. The turnout delayed many results, that is to say the high turnout. But by 11:15 p.m. Tuesday, 27 of those candidates, the 35 around the country, I guess, had lost, and 4 candidates had won, with some districts yet to report their results. In many cases, the members of the movement, who often were pushing back against diversity training, pandemic protocols, and sex and gender education in schools, were the lowest vote getters. Among those who lost was Doug Lloyd, who ran a campaign in Bethlehem that was supported by the town GOP committee. He came in a distant 4th in a race for 2 seats. Other members of the movement who lost, often by wide margins, were in Averill Park, Ballston Spa. I'm trying to get some sense. Is this a national collection? It doesn't say like what state these are in. And are all readers of the Times Union to assume that these are all in whatever state the Times Union circulates in? Averill Park, Ballston Spa, Burnt Hills, Ballston Lake, South Colony, North Colony, Guilderland, isn't that the... no, it's just Gilder, right? But Guilderland from The Princess Bride. Lake George, I guess New York, right? Lansingburg, Mohonasen, I have no idea how you would pronounce it. I don't even know where it is. Chalmont, Scotia Glenville, Shenandoah, like not Shenandoah, but I guess maybe the Native American, or more Native American-y spelling than Shenandoah, Shenandoah, and Voorheesville. Saratoga Springs was the only large capital region school district with no vote totals as yet, as of 11:15 p.m. So now I'm starting to think New York? Yeah, I guess so, because, well, more hints. However, in Schenectady, Vivian Parsons, who is open to book banning and opposes critical race theory, won. That's too bad. That race was also controversial because of more proposed officers in the schools, which Parsons supports. I guess people wanted that if nothing else. A candidate with those conservative views at Ichabod Crane Schools also won. That can't be anything but New York, right? As did two candidates in Duanesburg who, during their campaign, posted that they were, quote, opposed to diversity, equity, and inclusion, a.k.a., in their view, critical race theory. Well, okay. Such candidates also describe themselves as for, quote, parents' rights or parents' choice, though there was little agreement on what those terms mean. Meet the Candidate events have included vehement debates about banning books, critical race theory, and social emotional learning. Many districts said they had twice as many voters as normal, and some reported hundreds of voters who had never participated in a school board election before. Averill Park had so many voters that it ran out of ballots Tuesday night. It had 2,000 computer-readable ballots and had to take further votes on pieces of paper. Pieces of paper? Well, that's what they were taking ballots on before, but okay. Special paper. Some voters said they came out because they wanted to stop the candidates who represented the movement. We haven't voted since our kids graduated from high school, said Kathy Condon of Schenectady, explaining that she felt voting on school matters no longer affected our lives. But this year, that calculation changed. We don't want any books banned from the library, and we don't want any religion in the schools, she said. We need people to be educated. We need it for our democracy. In Bethlehem, many voters did not mince words about how they felt about Lloyd, saying they felt he was dangerous and being deliberately untruthful to sow fear. We came out predominantly to address that in our votes, said Bethlehem resident Barbara DeVore. In North Colony, spelled with an I-E at the end, some voters said they agreed with the parents' rights movement, though they declined to give their names. Things are going on that parents aren't aware of, said one North Colony voter. Things are being said in the name of equity. Oh my God, the name of equity? Don't say that, right? Oh my God. School budgets throughout the region passed as expected by observers because none of the local school boards proposed trying to exceed the tax cap. So nothing to be afraid of. But that's interesting. So all of those, I think, from New York State. As we said, also similar thing in Durham, where 5 Republicans vying to win control of Durham's progressive school board were soundly defeated in Tuesday's election. 4 of the 5 finished last in their respective races. Durham's progressive incumbents, Natalie Beyer, Matt Sears, and Bettina Umstead, won 3 of the 5 seats up for grabs. Voters added 2 newcomers, Emily Chavez and Millicent Rogers. The 3 incumbents and Rogers are registered Democrats. Chavez is registered unaffiliated. Tuesday's winners will serve on the board. None of the GOP candidates who ran together under the banner Better Board, Better Schools in the nonpartisan election seriously challenged the progressive candidates. The concerted attempt to elect a slate of GOP candidates was always a long shot in Durham County, where Democratic voters outnumber Republicans more than 5-1. I don't know why they thought we would be vulnerable, Sears said on Wednesday. I think it'll be interesting to look at their campaign finance reports when they're final, to see if they thought that money could buy seats. That is interesting. And let's read a little bit about the concerted national effort here we're reading from NC, North Carolina, PolicyWatch.com. Republicans in Durham and elsewhere have sought to cash in on voters' discontent over lengthy pandemic-related school closures, mask mandates, unfounded claims about critical race theory, and other wedge issues. And nationally, conservatives have their sights on the November general election and are betting on those wedge issues to help erase slender Democratic majorities in the House and Senate. On Tuesday, Valerie Jarvis, the wife of Emmanuel Jarvis, chairman of the Durham County Republican Party, fared best among the Better Board, Better Schools candidates. She finished second in a 3-way race for Durham's District 4 school board seat. Beyer won with nearly 49% of the vote, according to final but unofficial election results. A day after her re-election, Beyer told Policy Watch that she welcomes the democratic process, which they capitalized. I think they were talking about this lowercase democratic process, and diverse voices weighing in on Durham's schools, but is disappointed by Better Board, Better Schools representatives' remarks disparaging public schools. It was particularly heartbreaking to see teachers come to the polls and be told by a Better Board, Better Schools representative how bad our schools are and how much they're failing children, Beyer said. That's a good point, really. These folks, teachers, are dedicated and are working tirelessly to serve students every day and to address systemic issues in a state that has historically underfunded its schools. Sears also lamented what he called the Better Board, Better Schools candidates' traditional uninformed tropes about the performance of public schools. Those tropes included comments about the school district's performance scores and suggestions that educators could do better if they tried harder, Sears said. There were also comments that suggested the district isn't being held accountable for tax dollars spent to educate children, he said. I heard a localized version of Make America Great Again, that is MAGA, right? Sears said, referring to former President Donald Trump's campaign mantra. Sears expects to see more GOP attempts to gain ground in one of the state's Democratic strongholds, noting a rowdy school board meeting in April with Free the Smiles advocates protesting pandemic-driven mask requirements. Free the smiles, please. The smiles are so important. A bill approved by a Republican-controlled General Assembly called the Free the Smiles Act would have allowed parents to opt out of such requirements, but Governor Roy Cooper vetoed the measure. Well, it's all very interesting, and also some mention of stealth Republicans down here that caught my eye. Let me see about this. Bill Busa, director of EQV Analytics, a Durham-based data science nonprofit that works to elect Democratic candidates, first wrote about the GOP school board candidates on the firm's website. He posted this celebratory tweet on Tuesday night saying, I'm grinning ear to ear in the ignominious defeat that Durham County GOP's QAnon stealth slate is suffering tonight. Here, represented by Rischuk and Burns, two of the candidates, I guess. Ordinarily, I'm not one to LOL, but LOL. Hashtag NCPol. All right. Even though the school board race was nonpartisan, Busa told Policy Watch last month that voters needed to know the candidate's party affiliation to make informed decisions. Right. They don't put that on the ballot. But, if they're put up by a Republican operation or Democratic operation for that matter, you want to know. EQV published a lengthy dossier called Can the GOP Take Over Blue Durham County's Board of Education? They're betting on it. That documented the candidates' GOP credentials. Busa also reported that county GOP leaders attempted to hide the candidates' conservative connections. The last thing on earth that the 5 Better Board, Better Schools candidates want you to know is their party affiliation, Busa wrote. Under this cloak of secrecy, the BBBS slate's candidates are all hyper-partisan Republicans. Very little of the Better Board, Better Schools campaign literature revealed that the candidates are Republicans. Emmanuel Jarvis downplayed the importance of party affiliation in an interview with Policy Watch in April. Even though Jarvis assembled the candidate list, he contends the county party didn't actively look for a Republican slate. Again, Jarvis is the head of the county's Republican Party, and he put the slate together. But it's nonpartisan. Of course, sure. Anyway. Glad they lost. That's good news. Good coverage from these two local sources. Thanks to Joshua Holland, for putting that little compilation together. I hope that there's more from around the country to come. All right, let's see. Other things to move on to. How about this? Somewhat related, I suppose. From the Wisconsin Examiner, also a more localized source, report says hundreds of state legislators have joined far-right Facebook groups. I think we probably anticipated this was the case, but I'd like to see it documented from time to time. Kira Lerner, I guess, takes that job on for the Wisconsin Examiner. More than 1 in 5 Republican state lawmakers across the country have joined at least one far-right Facebook group, according to a new report. And now that we know that so many of them are subject to manipulation by Russian intelligence, well, that's not a good thing, is it? Unless you're Russian. Together, the lawmakers sponsored 963 bills during the most recent legislative sessions, said the group that wrote the report, which describes the far-right efforts as anti-human rights. Let's see what they have to say here. The Institute for Research and Education on Human Rights, a think tank that defends democracy and, you won't be surprised, human rights, identified 875 lawmakers who have joined at least one of 789 different Facebook groups, including white nationalist groups, groups tied to QAnon, groups that spout conspiracy theories about COVID, and others that promote former President Donald Trump's big lie that voter fraud cost him the 2020 election. The Institute's report, titled Breaching the Mainstream, it's a good title, lists all of the legislators identified as being part of far-right Facebook groups and details their legislative impact. We knew we had a problem on our hands, but we hadn't been able to quantify the depths of it, said Devin Burghardt, president and executive director of the Institute. This was the first attempt on our part to wrap our heads around it, and it was pretty striking in terms of the various pipelines that have opened up to pump disinformation and far-right ideas into legislatures. It's a good study. The legislators who have joined far-right groups made up 21.74% of all Republican legislators and 0.09% of all Democratic state legislators in the 2021 and 2022 legislative sessions, according to the report. More than 75% of the legislators in far-right Facebook groups identify as male, that's the modern way of putting it, while 24.45% identify as female. Nationally, 31.2% of all legislative seats are currently held by women. And I would imagine if you're talking about legislators who have joined far-right Facebook groups, my guess is that you have it covered in separating them into those that identify as male and those that identify as female. I would imagine the number is negligible among self-identified, gender-fluid, far-right state legislators. I'm guessing we're not missing a whole lot here, but there could be at least one somewhere. Anyway, while the legislators in far-right groups come from all 50 states, some states are represented more than others. The representation is highest in New Hampshire, where there are 62 such members, but that's because there are 5,000 state legislators in a state of 4,000 residents. But okay. Followed by Pennsylvania with 40, Minnesota with 39, Missouri with 36, Montana with 34, Maine with 34, Georgia 32, Washington 30, and Maryland 27. How interesting. Maryland, I think, among the bluer of those states, but okay. The state lawmakers are also spread out in all regions of the country. Currently, 220 of them represent districts in the Midwest, 191 in the Northeast, 264 in the South, and 200 in the West. It's a nationwide phenomenon, Burghardt said. Far too often, people think of this activity as being relegated to the Deep South or the Pacific Northwest. But there are legislators in all 50 states who have joined these different far-right Facebook groups. Many of the legislators identified have been at the forefront of pushing anti-democracy and anti-human rights bills, according to the report. The lawmakers identified have supported far-right legislation, including Don't Say Gay proposals, like in Florida, and copyright bills elsewhere, and bills targeting the teaching of critical race theory in schools. That certainly has happened everywhere, even though their candidates for school board have lost, or at least in most cases. They've proposed bills attacking women's reproductive rights, immigrants, and the LGBTQIA, adding those two again, community, the report noted. There was a very high level of support and sponsorship of bills coming from this cluster of legislators that we've identified, Burghardt said. Now, the local angle here for Wisconsin, the report's appendix lists 12 members of the Wisconsin Assembly and 3 state senators. A chapter that profiles a handful of state lawmakers from around the country includes a brief sketch of State Representative Dan Knodl, Knodl, from Germantown. The other Wisconsin lawmakers listed in the report, for those of you listening from Wisconsin. In the Assembly, Representatives Janelle Brandtjen, Brandtjen, Robert Brooks, Rachel Cabral Guevara, John Plumer, or Plummer, no B in there, but Plumer, Timothy Rathman, Donna Rosar, Michael Schraa, Schraa, John Spiros, Jeremy Thiesfeld, John Tussler, and Speaker Robin Voss makes the list. In the Senate, just 3, but we'll bring you their names after this.
Sup fam, it's your boy Darwin, aka Darwin_Darko, aka the most reasonable man in America, aka KITM's senior black correspondent. You might remember me from such recordings as Spacemen vs. Space Cadets and We Need to Talk About Joe Biden. Today, I want to bring you good news about that thing you've been struggling with. Do you suffer from giving too much of a damn? Do you turn on the series of tubes and find yourself outraged at the particular way some news organization strung some sentences together only to realize, nope, this is not some fictional hellscape? Well, guess what? You no longer have to accept the life of giving too much of a damn. You can do something about it, because even you, yes you, can be a show contributor. Now I know what you're thinking. Hey, Mr. Most Reasonable Man in America, I'm not some professional podcast talking guy. Don't worry about it. Do you have a smartphone or some other electronic recording device? Well, that's all you need. You too can have a segment where you can read us an important article and give us your take. Read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Fair warning though, side effects may include general punditry, having opinions and hot takes, getting stuff off your chest, and hearing your own voice. If your recording lasts longer than 5 to 7 minutes, please consult kagrox@gmail.com. That's KAGROX@gmail.com.
All right, we're back now. Welcome back to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Edwards Radio. And, we promised, if you're hanging on the edge of your seat listening in Wisconsin and trying to get the lowdown on who were the state senators who were involved in the right-wing Facebook groups, your wait is over. Senators Mary Felskowski, Dale Kuyenga, and Patrick Testin are the allegedly guilty parties here. So let's see. That's the actual end of the article. That was all that was left, but hey, you run out of time, you run out of time. So, okay, thanks to Kara Lerner and the Wisconsin Examiner for bringing that report to light. I think it would be interesting. And again, it was the what's the name of the think tank that prepared it? The Institute for Research and Education on Human Rights put out this report, and you can find it at their website. And of course, they abbreviate that. But Institute for Research and Education on Human Rights, the IREHR.org. IREHR, I guess. IREHR.org. And that's where, you'll find the thing parked there under reports. Breaching the Mainstream is the name of the report that they're talking about. And interesting, a unique angle. I like the methodology. It's probably an easy thing to do given that you can't be usually a viable political candidate for state legislative office without a Facebook account. And then that makes it pretty easy for you to check on what they're joining and what they're following. Most of them probably would insist to you, well, that's not a far-right group. But, that's up to you, I guess, to decide whether or not they've categorized things correctly. And you can take a look through their report and decide whether they're overdoing it or not. And whether your state representatives, if they're on this list, have overstepped their bounds by going and taking a look. You might have to wade into some dirty places, but some of them are probably pretty obvious on their face. At any rate, many other things to wade through here and to contemplate. How do we want to spend the last segment of today's show? Well, there's a couple of thoughts I have on it, and one good way of doing it would be to turn to foreign affairs, our foreign affairs corner in the last half hour. But we could put ourselves under time pressure, or by adding a different story, or go in a different direction completely. We shared during the week number of listings of other articles that we didn't read all the way through, but people's different takes on the headlines of the rights violence problem. I think that was the the New York Times version from David Leonhardt, whose bad reputation I couldn't get past to read this thing. But the Guardian writing on Fox News, going quiet on Great Replacement Theory. The Washington Post, which featured Margaret Sullivan's story of the Murdochs being behind the promulgation of Great Replacement Theory, etc. But it's always a good bet to spend some time with Adam Serwer, which we'll do thanks to The Atlantic publishing his article. Conservatives are defending a sanitized version of the Great Replacement. I guess I didn't realize that they were bothering to sanitize it. But if by chance you have the opportunity to cast your vote in opposition to a Republican who might be using some sanitized version here as opposed to the straight up, every night on Fox News Tucker Carlson version, perhaps you should be aware of it. Their reaction to the Buffalo shooting, the subheader says, shows that the racist theory has now entered the Republican mainstream. We knew this to be the case, but let's take a look at it through Adam Serwer's eyes. Always a good use of your time, I think. 3 years ago, when a white supremacist fanatic killed dozens of people in El Paso, Texas, the reaction from the right was unreserved condemnation. That's just 3 years ago. When another white supremacist fanatic killed 10 people at a supermarket in a black neighborhood in Buffalo, New York last week, the reaction from some figures on the right was to acknowledge that the guy had a point about this whole replacement thing. Large sections in the manifesto attributed to the Buffalo shooter were plagiarized from the writings of the perpetrator of another racist massacre in Christchurch, New Zealand. Both share the premise that violence against non-white people is justified to prevent white genocide or the replacement of white Americans, or in his case in New Zealand, white New Zealanders, by non-white immigrants. As the alleged Buffalo shooter put it, he carried out the attack because, quote, all black people are replacers just by existing in white countries. I would offer to explain how black people got to the United States, but who knows if critical race theory remains legal where you're reading this. Good point there, too. In recent years, Fox News has consciously amplified the same line of argument, with popular hosts such as Tucker Carlson and Laura Ingraham echoing its logic. Carlson, for example, has said that, quote, the Democratic Party is trying to replace the current electorate, the voters now casting ballots with new people, more obedient voters from the third world, while Ingraham has maintained that Democrats, quote, want to replace you, the American voters, with newly amnestied citizens and an ever-increasing number of chain migrants, whatever that's supposed to mean. Having promoted the conspiracy theory for years, Carlson told his audience recently that we're still not sure what it is, before reaffirming its veracity. The noxious ideology is now too popular on the right to isolate without risking bitter intra-conservative conflict. And so, as the New Yorker writer Jonathan Chait notes, right-wing media figures have taken to defending and rationalizing the claims that motivated the shooter while condemning the violence itself. So, just to get this straight, the left argues that demographics are destiny, that demographics change in America will inevitably lead to a progressive majority, and it's Republicans who are echoing the Great Replacement theory, huffed the conservative pundit Ben Shapiro. National Review's editor-in-chief Rich Lowry posited that it was true that Democrats want higher levels of immigration to change national elections. At the core of the idea of American democracy is a promise of civic equality, initially extended to just a chosen few. The key political conflicts of American history have been over expanding that promise. The white genocide or great replacement theory rests on the ideological principle that certain people should be excluded from that promise, or that extending it to them would constitute a form of bondage for those whom the promise was originally the promise was originally kept. Because the threat of the interlopers, whether religious, racial, or ethnic, is existential, it justifies violence in the form of murder, disenfranchisement, or dispossession. The ideology of great replacement is a particular threat to democracy's democratic governance, because it insists that entire categories of human beings can or should be excluded from democratic rights and protections. Any political cause can theoretically inspire terrorism, but this one is unlike others in that what it demands of its targets is their non-existence. In 1916, the American immigration reconstructionist Madison Grant published The Passing of the Great Race, which argued that immigration was destroying America's traditional, quote, Anglo-Saxon population, and along with it, the tradition of self-governance. Grant's ideas were popular and influential. They provided the impetus for racist immigration laws passed in the 1920s, which sought to limit not only African and Asian immigration, but also that of Eastern and Southern Europeans, who were deemed genetically inferior to the Northern European counterparts. Adolf Hitler, of course, cited these racist laws as an inspiration. But for some ascendant nativist intellectuals on the right now commonly refer to their repeal as a great catastrophe. There are two versions of the replacement conspiracy theory, but both of them share the same basic premise. The first version is the idea that a secret cabal, typically one that is composed of Jews, is fostering demographic change in the United States through immigration in order to replace its white population, the motive of mass murderers in Pittsburgh, El Paso, and now Buffalo. The second is that liberals are fostering demographic change in the United States through immigration in order to replace its white population. I mean, how's that different? I'm not even sure. The first version is that the secret cabal is fostering demographic change through immigration in order to replace its white population. The second is that liberals are fostering demographic change through immigration in order to replace its white population. That's the same. Is that intentional? Am I missing the point here? Is he just basically saying they're all the same? Both conceive of America as fundamentally white and Christian, and in so doing posit not only a racial conception of citizenship, but a racial hierarchy, one that must be maintained if America's true nature is to endure. That these theories are now embraced by the descendants of some of the very European immigrants whom Grant considered racially inferior might have shocked him, but that just shows how arbitrary and socially determined such categories are. That is to say, their gimme-tarianism. This conspiracy theory has grown so popular among key GOP figures that the conservative elite can no longer condemn it unreservedly. Instead, some prominent conservatives have chosen to defend it in sanitized form, arguing that the Democratic Party's support for immigration reform is a plot, as Representative Elise Stefanik of New York put it in an ad last year, a plot to overthrow our current electorate and create a permanent liberal majority in Washington. Note the notion that an electorate can be overthrown by being outvoted, as though Republican electoral defeat is by definition illegitimate, especially if that victory is enabled by the wrong kind of voters. But all versions of this conspiracy theory are not only racist, they're also false. Democrats and Republicans alike have at various times sought comprehensive immigration reform as a way to win over Latino and Asian American voters. And implicit in this idea that they need to be won over, or in this idea is the idea that they need to be won over. George W. Bush tried to do it in 2006, and was foiled by talk radio revolt. Barack Obama tried to pass an immigration reform bill and failed because his ramping up of immigration enforcement and deportation did not bring Republicans to the negotiating table. Republicans briefly reconsidered the idea after losing the 2012 election, the autopsy, remember that, and instead walked the path of Trumpism. As with Obama, Biden's decision to leave many of Trump's immigration policies in place has done nothing to quiet conservative hysteria about open borders. Right? Keep that in mind every time they say, Biden's for open borders. Biden has been for keeping your policies in place, hoping that you would not be mean to him. He's hopefully now realizing that it was useless. The argument that the growing non-white population is intrinsically advantageous to Democrats is itself absurd because racial identities are no more fixed than political ones. The migration of the mid-20th century white ethnics from the Democratic column to the Republican column being an object lesson. If any Democrats or Republicans believe that demographic change inherently advantages one party over the other, they are tremendously foolish. For any conservative worried that immigrants will lead to permanent democratic rule, I've got some wonderful news. History has shown that will never happen. In the 2020 election, if anything, the 2020 election, if anything, illustrated the persuadability of such voters, as Donald Trump amassed historic margins with Latino voters in Florida and along the Rio Grande Valley. We've discussed that on the show extensively. That communities in Texas, for example, where policing the border and extractive industries employ large numbers of residents, would choose Trump over Joe Biden should not be surprising. These voters are no less rational or independent than white people, and Republican nativism is clearly insufficient to help to make them reliable Democratic stalwarts. They are not mystically immune to conservative arguments about religion, culture, economics, or even immigration. In fact, many immigrants arrive in the United States sharing such premises. The hypothesis that immigration reform would be an overwhelming boon among such voters has been disproved. Trump won many of them over while enacting immigration policies that were both cruel and counterproductive. Nevertheless, the conspiracy theory of the Great Replacement is now part of the Republican mainstream, as I warned it would become 4 years ago. During the Trump administration, conservative elites could distance themselves from Trump as an individual while still supporting his policies. But now that so many important Republicans have embraced the idea, the conservative elite must find a way to make the sanitized version of this genocidal nonsense respectable. A strain of self-implicating paranoia underlies the entire concept. The fear that once they are a minority, white people will be subject to revenge for the dark chapters of American history, a past that Republican-controlled states are attempting to erase. But actually, that jives quite nicely with what we read earlier about Madison Cawthorn, who explicitly declares that it is the intent of people like him to exact revenge as dark MAGA. Just let me read you again, right, what the way Adam puts it. He's talking about a different darkness here, but a strain of self-implicating paranoia underlies the entire concept, a fear that once they're in the minority, white people will be subject to revenge. Once again, every Republican accusation is a confession. They fear revenge against them. So in order to prevent you from getting into a position to exact that revenge, they swear they will exact revenge on you first. That's pretty interesting. Liberals can do nothing to prevent conservatives from embracing this conspiracy theory beyond forcing Republicans to pay a political price at the ballot box. Well, there are other things, but they're not supposed to be legitimate parts of political discourse, and Adam's being good here. It would be better by far if prominent conservatives persuaded their comrades to reject this perverse ideology rather than attempt to sanitize it for mainstream consumption. If their recent reaction to the Buffalo shooter is any guide, though, they have chosen a different path. And so they have. But good reminder that as they say, their great fear is that they will fall victim to revenge against white elites at some point. Even as they express that as their fear, those unmoored by the responsibilities of office, if there ever were, like Madison Cawthorn, vow they'll be the ones taking revenge. So you know how to regard that. All right. Well, I mentioned that there was some possibility for some foreign affairs focus. And this one's been lingering in pocket for a little while and taunting me. And I don't know how good it is, but it's very long and we won't get all the way through it. So you'll be able to read it over the weekend and judge whether you think it was time well spent. From Grid News, which I don't know anything about. And only after I parked this interesting sounding article in pocket for a while and then still remain convinced that it's interesting sounding, did I notice that Grid News has been pushing its way into my Twitter feed through promoted tweets as opposed to the curated version of the old Twitter timeline where it would take somebody that I have some interest in following for some reason recommending the article. So I don't know whether it's any good or whether it's just a good bunch of people who happen to be using Twitter promotions to reach a wider audience. But this was an intriguing sounding look at the Russia-Ukraine issue. How Putin is rewriting Russia's history to serve his own agenda in Ukraine. We've certainly heard inklings about this along the way. The erasure of Ukrainian culture and history. The subheader here, the Russian leader's worldview is informed by things that happened more than a millennium ago. And we value our history in this world, but you got to tell it straight. And of course, it's something that's manipulable. And the more distant in the past it is, perhaps in some cases, the easier it is to manipulate it. After all, the truth may be lost in the mists of time. Joshua Keating is the author of this piece. It's dated May 9th, so it's getting on in years. That is to say, days. You know how news cycles go. Anyway, let's read on. How far back do you have to go to tell the story of Russia's invasion of Ukraine? Right, good question, right? We could start with 2014, when a pro-Russian president was ousted and the Kremlin first sent troops into the country. Or maybe 2005, when the Orange Revolution kicked off Ukraine's drift out of Russia's political orbit. Perhaps you need to go back to 1991, when the Soviet Union fell apart and the two countries became independent. No, Vladimir Putin would say, yet I guess he would really say, you need to go much further back than that, to 1941 at least, or maybe 1917. Depending on the Russian president's mood, you might even hear about 1654, or even 988 and 882. I have, of course, no idea what we're talking about here, but hopefully we'll find a little bit about this here. Putin is hardly the only world leader who refers frequently to his nation's glorious history, but to an unusual extent he seems to be living in the past, viewing current events through the prism of things that happened dozens or even hundreds of years ago. And that view is certainly influencing his actions as president. According to a New York Times account, based on interviews with those who've interacted with him recently, Putin has, quote, completely lost interest in the present and spends much of his time poring over Russian history with his closest confidants. Visiting foreign leaders are often treated to extended harangues on Russian history. I guess back when the lines were blurred between Russia, the emerging Moscow-centric Russia, the still Kiev Greater Russia, or whatever you called it back then, or the Kievan Rus, or Belarus for that matter. Anyway, interesting. I mean, it's fascinating history, but yeah, at some point perhaps it becomes less relevant. Putin's penchant for playing amateur historian was perhaps demonstrated most dramatically by a 7,000-word essay published under his byline on the Kremlin website last summer, in which he enlisted more than 1,000 years of history to make the case that Russia and Ukraine are, in fact, one nation. He drew on many of the same historical arguments about the supposed illegitimacy of the Ukrainian state in his rambling February 21st speech announcing the deployment of Russian troops to the occupied regions of Donetsk and Luhansk. to the prelude to the all-out invasion. Among other themes, the speech spent several paragraphs assailing Russian communist revolutionary Vladimir Lenin as the creator and architect of Ukraine's illegitimate statehood. Putin was always interested in history from the very beginning of his presidency. Ivan Kurila, not gorilla, Kurila. We have a gorilla who's a professor of history at the European University at St. Petersburg, who studies the political use of history in contemporary Russia, told Grid. Kurila said that for a long time he viewed Putin's historical rhetoric as just instrumental, just a tool. But lately he's come to see it differently. When Putin started to explain his Ukrainian war with a long lecture about history, I started to think that actually he's quite serious. He has some weird ideas about the past and about Russian history, and he's trying to find a place for himself in that history. So what are those ideas, and what do they suggest about how Putin views the war he's unleashed? Start with the deep past. The visitors to the Kremlin on April 20th may have been puzzled. At a meeting with a delegation of school children and administrators from education nonprofits, Putin launched into a digression, questioning what he called the Norman theory of the foundation of the Russian state. It was the sort of historical non sequitur that tends to be lost on those not versed in Russian history, but provides some clues on his worldview. Some background: from more than a millennium ago, according to legend, Rurik, a Viking prince, and there are some weird white nationalists who espouse this, was invited by the Slavic people of Novgorod, in what is now northwest Russia, to be their ruler during a time of turmoil in the 860s. Rurik's successor, Oleg, then relocated south to Kiev, founding what is now known as the Kievan Rus, the predecessor state to both Russia and Ukraine. Most historians don't take the Rurik legend at face value, but they agree that Rus had Viking origins. As Ukrainian historian Serhei Plokhy has written, the word Rus, R-U-S, like as in Russia, was probably first used by local Slavs to refer to Swedes. It was adapted from a Swedish word meaning men who row. Okay, maybe. Faith Hillis, a professor of Russian history at the University of Chicago, said the notion that Rus was founded by Scandinavians has implications that are offensive and bewildering to Russian nationalists who are trying to say we were foreordained by God to have this wonderful state. Okay. In his remarks, drawing on this Russian nationalist historical tradition, Putin referred to an opinion, that's in scare quotes, that Rurik had a mother from the Slavs. He added that the mere fact that someone was around in Russia at the time to invite Rurik to rule suggests there was a quasi-state or proto-state in Russia at the time. The point, for Putin, Slavic Russians have ruled these lands, modern Ukraine included, for more than 1,000 years. Another key and contested figure in the story is Vladimir the Great, the ruler of Kievan Rus, who converted the kingdom to Christianity in 988. As the Putin regime has sought to more closely associate itself with the Orthodox Church and conservative religious values, the veneration of Vladimir has also increased. In 2016, a 52-foot statue of Vladimir was unveiled just outside the Kremlin, a move seen as politically provocative in Ukraine, which claims Volodymyr, as they spell it with the Y's, as its own. In a confluence of history and the current war, the current presidents of both countries share his name. For Putin, as he explained in that long essay last summer, it's of critical importance that Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians are all descendants of ancient Rus, bound together by one language, which we now refer to as Old Russian, economic ties, the rule of the princes of the Rurik dynasty, and, after the baptism of Rus, the Orthodox faith. Translation: all these lands have been Russian since the beginning and should be Russian now. Alas, history is complicated, and quite a bit has happened in the intervening millennium to divide the two nations. Kievan Rus was conquered by the Mongols in the 13th century, and the western part of Ukraine was later absorbed into Poland. This interrupts the Putin nationalist narrative, and it's why 1654 is another key date. That's the year when Ukrainian Cossacks fighting Polish domination swore allegiance to the Russian Tsar. From that moment on, in Putin's view, the Cossacks referred to and defined themselves as Russian Orthodox people. A divided nation was reunited. But, said Hillis, this history is also contested. Russians talk about 1654 as the reunification of the two parties, whereas Ukrainians think about it as a treaty between two states that had certain overlapping interests. Hillis said it's clear from Putin's statement that he's just not making this up. There's a long-standing precedent for his arguments. She suspects that he's mainly been reading 19th century historians, imperial historians, who are very interested in the origins of Rus. It's an interpretation of history that's tailor-made for Putin's current political priorities. Well, there's plenty more where that came from, and you should, in fact, I think, spend some time reading through this. It's enlightening, even if it doesn't unravel everything, and ultimately Putin will be gimmitarian no matter what he does. But it's interesting to find where he finds his historical justification for these things. Time now, of course, for the historical justification of the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy, which regenerates itself every weekday and comes up next right here on Netroots Radio. Let's see. What's up for the show today? Tops on the list. The Electoral College is a standing crime on America. An interesting approach.
You have been listening to Kagro in the morning with David Waldman.
Let's skip down to see what's on the international frontier. The Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, accused Russia of using food as a weapon against millions around the world. And Poland said it will assist Sweden and Finland should they be attacked before obtaining NATO membership. Don't forget about Poland. Next.